Alrighty, welcome everybody. We're right at 12:30, so we're going to get started just to respect everybody's time. And I'm going to give everyone a little intro and then I'll turn it over to Dr. Rob. So welcome everybody. We are excited to have you all here with us today, and we are excited to have this partnership and presentation with ABHM. And for those of you who don't know the MCHS, we are a nonprofit historical membership society in Milwaukee. The mission of the MCHS is to promote a greater appreciation of Milwaukee County's heritage, local history, and the Historical Society hopes to develop a better understanding of the issues and challenges facing Milwaukee County today. The MCHS Museum and Research Center is located on Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Drive in downtown Milwaukee. And through this series, Lunch and Learn virtual program series, we hope to bring the MCHS to your home by diving into a variety of topics centered on Milwaukee history and culture. Today's program is the part 2 of our African American History in Milwaukee series, and it's from 1960s to present day. Historian Kitonga Alexander will be presenting, and Dr. Robert Smith, resident historian and director of education at the America's Black Holocaust Museum, will be hosting today. And I will turn it over to Dr. Rob.
Thank you very much, Olivia. It's a pleasure to be in conversation with folks today. At America's Black Holocaust Museum, obviously, we do tackle the very challenging topics associated with racial violence, making sure to walk in the legacy of Dr. James Cameron and not at all avoiding those difficult topics, but also doing so with the full intent to create opportunities for discussion, some reconciliation, repair, and in this moment in particular, for museums, cultural organizations, archives, historical societies, it's really, really critical that we partner and collaborate and make sure that we are engaging history, preserving history, heralding history, and doing so from a place of compassion and concern as the world around us feels tumultuous, to say to put that as kindly as we can put it. But I'm really, really excited today, folks. Milwaukee's own, very recently completed a dissertation. I'm both excited and really really proud, to be perfectly honest. I was able to read and take part in the process by which Dr. Kitonga Alexander finished this dissertation, and you all are in for a wonderful conversation today. You're in for a really brilliant set of ideas associated with Milwaukee's history in the post-1960 moment. And what I'd like to do is just very briefly give Dr. Kitonga Alexander a warm welcome. Use whatever emojis you can use. If you can snap fingers, applaud, please join me in congratulating Dr. Kitonga Alexander, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much. Well, we don't have much time, Doc, and we got a captive audience and a hot mic, so we probably should get to it.
Absolutely.
Just very briefly, give us a bit of an introduction. Who is Kitonga Alexander, and maybe more accurately, who is Dr. Kitonga Alexander? And then we'll get into some of our questions around your research.
Well, I'm a Milwaukee native. A lot of the research or information that I'm going to talk to you all about Milwaukee, Black Milwaukee, I've not only studied, I've also been a participant. Being born here, I was a part of a lot of organizations or a lot of movements in Milwaukee. So a lot of the information that I'm talking about, I was there, I was in it. It wasn't a direct actor of it. That's pretty much who I am. If I'm briefly going to talk about it, I'm a historian, probably by birth, first generation Milwaukeean, with family that was participants in the Great Migration from the South to Milwaukee. So that's pretty much me.
Yeah. Well, thank you. We're going to hear some more of that, certainly. But let's get right to it. You know, you and I have talked about this quite a bit, and I really am excited for folks to hear how you conceptualize a lot of these ideas. Um, you use the voices of Black Milwaukeeans in your research.
Yeah.
Talk about those contributions. Um,
Well,
Talk a little bit about how you connect those voices and bring those voices into the city's rich history.
you know, the use of voices from the community actually it comes out of frustration. Actually, we most of our work, including me, I'm putting myself in that category. Most of our work, our research on Black Milwaukee is, you know, we're in the records, we're in the archives, and a lot of that is political records, you know, housing records and employment records. So we usually assess Black Milwaukee from the data, right? And it excludes so much of the information that exists about, you know, entrepreneurs, grassroots organizers who don't make the newspaper, who don't uh, fit inside the informational narratives that we, you know, we're not doing it facetiously. We're forced to because that's what we have to go with. And so being a participant in Black Milwaukee, being born here, I looked at a lot of the information and we talked about things like historical Bronzeville and these entities. And growing up in Milwaukee, we had no clue about these things. And so, how could a person who was a participant inside of what I'm studying not know about it? And there's a disconnect there. And the disconnect is missing the voices of the people who are actually within. So those voices help guide the entire dissertation. Although a part of the dissertation there has a heavy focus on them, if throughout they are the actors of each chapter of this dissertation. So they are very important to guiding this research and guiding what is coming.
Yeah, thank you so very much for that because, you know, as scholars, we shape narratives, quite honestly. And it is important that in the process of shaping those narratives, we get as many voices into the conversation, particularly those voices that are directly responsible for some of the institutional questions that you raise, for some of the community and neighborhood based questions and thoughts that you share. And so those voices really are prominent and ring out very prominently in your research. Folks, as much as we are talking about um, Milwaukee's history post 1960. You are going to hear us talk quite a bit about Kitonga's dissertation, Black Milwaukee, Resilience in the Face of Adversity. And, you know, one of the many important threads that you provide is that you do challenge, which is what we're supposed to do, you do challenge some of the historical discourse about how Milwaukee's represented, about which voices are included and are not. You also explore and critique some of the dominant narratives around migration, employment and industrialization, deindustrialization, um, school reform. You know, you take quite a bit of these key threads to task. But let's start with the one that we all typically start with. Let's begin with migration. Tell us a little bit about what you argue around how migration informs what becomes Black Milwaukee. How did migration impact Black Milwaukee from 1960 to present?
Well, you know, Black Milwaukee essentially, and some of the natives will push back on this, but Black Milwaukee is essentially a story of migration. Many of the actors or people who, you know, made what we recognize today as the glorious Bronzeville or these areas were migrants to Milwaukee. Many of the school reformers, many of the entrepreneurs, advocates. There's a large portion of those individuals who are extreme contributors to Black Milwaukee who are migrants from somewhere else. And so that migration takes a significant is a significant part of Black Milwaukee. Now, there's another element to migration. Milwaukee started late with the migration in comparison to places like Chicago, who are more formed after World War I. Even though we're very close, and some of our population is a trickle down from Chicago, but very minimally until after World War II. What we find is even after World War II and after wartime industries, we still see the population or migration increasing in Milwaukee. So we're on the late show, but we're moving big on the late show. The height of the population for Black Milwaukee was actually in the 1980s. And you would think that after a decade of deindustrialization, we would be talking about an extreme decline. But that comes just a little bit later. So Milwaukee continues to increase in bursts, of course, and migration all the way into the 90s.
It is interesting to me that you do provide this very important lens of we can look at the period under question with migration as bookends
Mhm.
almost. And now there's constant movement, as you highlight, but we're talking 1960 to present. Let's bring forward to migration in a more contemporary sense. And then we'll get to some of that history, 60s and 70s here in just a second. But if we begin this conversation with migration in the post-World War II moment, that immediate post-World War II moment, tell us a little bit about what you know about migration today over the last decade or so in reference to Black Milwaukee.
Well, African Americans have always been in motion. Let me start with that, right? And that predates the large population of Milwaukee, and is going to continue. What we see about Milwaukee, of course, with the industrialization, we see the migration or the idea of the migration out. A lot of contributors to Black Milwaukee. And when I'm saying contributors, that's just a nice way of saying people who, are employed, people who are in advocacy positions that are in Black Milwaukee. A large portion of them are serving Black Milwaukee from outside of Black Milwaukee. So they have a personal endearment for the city and the city's progress, but they also have a personal need for certain necessities, and that could be particular incomes, that could be jobs. Unfortunately, Milwaukee and Black Milwaukee hasn't had this niche for what is the employment sector. So there's a lot of question marks around employment that provide people an outlet to look elsewhere. Now, we're also looking at union issues. In the South doesn't have strong unions. A lot of the factories, not the old factories in itself, but even some new factories where we see a lot of car dealerships, a lot of foreign car dealerships like Toyota and Maserati. All of these dealerships start building plants in the South, right? And so now we see this migration from the South to places like Milwaukee following industrial employment, and now we see a migration to the South, not just for industrial employment, but industrial employment in the South kind of sets the foundation. And then the outskirts, of course, they have educational facilities. They have everything we have. Plus, they have things like, these new car plants. And that gives people the notion or idea for upward mobility in other places. And so we do see that narrative of, people leaving the city, but we still have a significant population of people who are still in the city making it work.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, the broader, really sophisticated arguments that you make about the two or so generations since the 60s. I mean, we're not talking about a long time historically, as we know, as historians. This is a short window of time in a lot of respects. But it does make room for some very important developments. But what you do is you challenge us to be far more complicated in our thinking. You very clearly say, yeah, there were some moments where we see some developments, some growth, some engagement in the industrial sector, some successes around other issues. But at the same time, there's continual adversity. adversity that you even say has compounded across institutions or across sectors. Tease that out for us a little bit. Give us that complicated dance that you want us to think about.
So, of course, employment is a big piece, right? But every individual, whether they're a migrant to a new place or they were born there, needs more than just the employment institution for their well-being. So people came to Milwaukee for employment, and they continue to come for employment. Um, and there were some gains in employment, right? The 60s, since we started in the 60s, it's a very pivotal era because we do see some victories at the end of the 60s, right? So employment, we have the employment piece that starts really before the 60s as far as victories, right? But then we had an issue with housing. So the 60s, we see open housing marching. We see a lot of advocacy around expanding the footprint of Black Milwaukee into houses or rental facilities outside of the parameter that African Americans were secluded to, right? And by the way, that parameter was not by choice. That parameter was by force. And so we saw advocacy of African Americans trying to push outside of those borders, and we see some victories in housing, right? Around 1968, we see a Fair Housing Act federally. Then we also see local policies get passed through the Common Council. And so it looks like a victory, right? But something is coming right on the cusp of these victories. So people are able to purchase houses, right? So they were able to expand out into new communities, like deeper into 53206, 53209, these other zip codes. We see this expansion of the Black footprint to where in the 70s, areas like 53209, not the Glendale 53209, but the Milwaukee 53209, are dominantly populated by African Americans very quick. So they start populating these areas in the early 70s, and by the end of the 70s, these are dominantly populated by African Americans. So a short time. However, 1971 starts deindustrialization. So a lot of individuals who were able to acquire these houses based on industrial employment were also starting to lose these jobs, which then didn't allow them to either keep or maintain housing. And I say keep or maintain because in order to maintain a house, as anybody that's a homeowner would know, it requires a certain amount of income. And so reductions of that income may allow some to keep, but not to maintain. And then it will also allow some to just not keep at all. Right. And so when we see this expansion into new neighborhoods, we only have a few years before we start seeing a decline in the quality of those neighborhoods based on the decline of employment. So what looks like a victory and what looks like the story of success actually starts to tell the story of what we will eventually recognize in media as 53206 and things like that. Now, very briefly, during this whole time, there was advocacy or concern for education, right? And so educational concerns predate the 1960s, of course, but the 1960s individuals bought on that same concern, right? So we have this push during the same time of housing reform for academic reform, but that does not actually take place until much later, right? And so these institutional adversities, while we celebrate the Fair Housing Act and we celebrate the opportunity, what was missing is not seeing that these other institutional issues are going to directly have an impact on housing. And so that's why I challenge us to look at what we consider a victory in the totality, because what is a victory on one end is also what's setting the foundation for failure on the other.
Yeah, and we certainly know that school reform in our city, school reform across the country is a staggered and in many cases frustrating history. There are all kinds of examples of whether it's the longstanding delay to desegregate schools, the challenges with and the resistance to busing, the complicated terrain of choice, charter, voucher, public, all of that speaks to that sort of symbiotic dance between adversity and success. But there's something that you highlight that I think is really important. Talk a little bit about Black women in industry, and some of those challenges, the uniquenesses of those issues. What's particularly important for us to think about as it relates to African American women?
So my work looks at this crisis, this generational crisis of joblessness that really starts in the 70s, but by the 90s, it's a crisis. All right. And that is deindustrialization. And it severely impacts African American males. Now, the reason for that is because African American women were denied much more access to industrial positions. When we look at the archives, we see a lot of the complaints against industrial facilities were made by women. And so they were being excluded from being hired. And they continue to be excluded. Even when we saw the victories, what we call the victories in employment, were the victories for men. Now, eventually, because deindustrialization comes in, we see women in other sectors maintain employment because they were denied access to industrial employment. So not to say what was a problem ends up becoming something that helps. I mean, they could have definitely benefit from that employment. A lot of individuals who were entrepreneurs were actually industrial employees too. So to say that, oh, it ended up being a good thing because the industrial facilities left and they still had outlets for employment is not actually very accurate, because people were using industrial employment for other sectors. So when we look at a person like Larry Hill, who is recognized for Larry's Lunchette, the restaurant. He had two other ones too, and a nightclub. But he actually worked in an industrial facility to generate the income to be able to have those. So we're not we're excluding women from having that opportunity for those entrepreneurial outlets that would have come from industrial employment. But they were definitely advocating for higher, excuse me, advocating for positions, industrial employment. So they have always been challenging this gender assigned roles.
Yeah, thank you for that. I want to get to Harambe. I'm looking at our time. We got about 20 minutes before we open it up for Q&A, and I know that's going to take us some time. There's some important threads there. Let's set this up though.
Okay.
We know how important Harambe as a school was, and you're going to tell us about that. I want to tee that up, but then also the broader community and what that means. But get us to Harambe. Talk a little bit about William Kelly. Talk a little bit about Lloyd Barbie. Let's get to some of those Harambe realities around school reform, school desegregation, or integration. Play with that history a little bit, and then let's get right to Harambe, because I really think that's the strength of your book.
Okay, so the 60s are important, right? And when I first started to have this talk, I thought like, no, let me start in the 70s, right? Because that's the least talked about period. But the 60s really set the foundation for this institutional, either institutional integration or institutional control, however you want to use, whatever term you want to use. So let's look at William Kelly. All right, we're going back now. We're going pre-60s a little bit, but we need to in order to set this up. William Kelly didn't use the um, Brown versus Board of Education to integrate schools per se pupils. William Kelly advocated for integration of more African American teachers, right? And so with some success there, it allowed teachers to have an institutional footprint in education, and that becomes very important later, where people start to actually migrate to Milwaukee to be teachers instead of migrating to Milwaukee for industrial positions, right? However, uh, Lloyd Barbie comes in and challenges the segregation in schools, right, of pupils. And he launches this campaign in the mid 60s to challenge segregated schools. The problem with that is the challenge to the challenge to the institution was actually there were a lot of failures. And people were, again, we in this time where people are also challenging housing, including Lloyd Barbie. Lloyd Barbie actually, before he challenges schools, does housing demonstrations in Madison, right? And those housing demonstrations basically allowed the NAACP to say, hey, move to Milwaukee and challenge this in these schools. So that's how he gets here. So he launches this campaign to challenge segregation in schools. And there are some successes, but those successes come much later. And by that time, people have been disconnected because there's also another emerging issue. And now we're stepping outside of schools altogether. There were a lot of individuals in the late 60s who were disappointed with the way the civil rights movement was going, and they were disconnected from the process. And one of those processes was integration. They felt like that the victories were too slow and too few between, and they were thinking of alternative ways or alternative methods. And one of those methods, besides institutional integration, is to form your own institutions. And so what we see in the late 60s is a different kind of mindset, right? We see this mindset of people who actually want to take complete control of their neighborhoods. Well, here's the situation. Now we have a lot of whites moving from these communities that were once heavily populated by whites. And so we see the private school sector that, churches have schools, and those schools were once thriving, but because the populations decreased, the schools were empty, right? And what initially happened is they started to allow the people who were in the neighborhood to join the schools. But remember, now we have these areas that are more populated by African Americans. So we see African Americans now who are disconnected from the public school system in Catholic schools. But the Catholic schools are losing money because their congregations are leaving. They're no longer able to support the physical facilities. A lot of the churches actually moved themselves, but the structures are still there. So that is what exactly happened with Harambe. In 1969, St. Elizabeth Church, which also had a school built, could no longer support the school, and they decided to give it to the parents of the individuals who wanted to stay, who happened to be African American, and they renamed the school from St. Elizabeth to Harambe. All right, and it went from being under the Catholic Archdiocese to being parent-run and parent-controlled.
This is such an important um, lesson in the long-standing conversation about the Black liberation struggle. One is the complexity. These are not monolithic ideas and strategies and ideologies. To some, integration might have been a cause. To some, integration may have been an idea that they were opposed to. Shifting political landscapes. You've mentioned the ways that the various sectors were steadily changing, shifting community and neighborhood demographics, and obviously then resources in various ways. But let's dig more into Harambe,
Okay.
because I think there's some key lessons from that case study. Talk to us about that school as a parent-run school. Give us an understanding of what that means, particularly in the landscape of such a complicated city in regards to school reform. What makes Harambe unique as a parent-run school? So give us some of that info.
So, being a parent-run school in itself is definitely unique. But what I will say is a lot of the original founders for Harambe were advocates, right? When I look at like Mildred Harpo, who becomes one of the first principals with Ron Johnson of Harambe, Mildred Harpo participated in the freedom schools. which Lloyd Barbie initiated as an act of protest, right? Because he was not getting enough victories or gains in integrating schools, and he basically made this threat: "Hey, we're going to start our own schools." It was going to be a day of protest, and people participated, thousands, and that sparked a lot of individuals who were now having this new mindset, right? And I should point this out. There were individuals who, of course, there were individuals who didn't necessarily need integration, but there were individuals who integration didn't matter. They wanted success regardless. So when I think about the philosophy of Mildred Harpo, who's one of the first principals of this school, and she's saying, like, I participated in the freedom schools, but I was fighting for integration as a participant. However, with this school at Harambe, she said the idea is, if you have a good academic plan, regardless of the race, regardless of the numbers determining if it's integrated or not, if it's a good plan, they will come. And so Harambe actually was integrated, right? It had a population, it had a Latino population, it had African American population, and it also had a white population for many years. And so Mildred Harpo is a participant in this school, which some people felt like it was an abandonment of the efforts of Barbie, because of course you go in private and not trying to integrate public. But her philosophy was, we're building a strong academic plan. Doesn't matter if it's public, doesn't matter if it's private. And parents got onto that. A lot of parents were frustrated with MPS, and not just frustrated with MPS. Of course, we're on the cusp of deindustrialization. So a lot of these individuals, men and women, have been disconnected from a lot of institutions, being their own institution was right on time. Now, Harambe was a school, but her serviced as a facility where people could congregate. Now, in order to talk about that, I'm going to take about 40 seconds to go a little bit back. The community, the thing we recognize as Bronzeville, and I'm only using the term Bronzeville for reference. That was not what it was called. It was, many times it wasn't called anything. But this community centered around Walnut Street became a beacon for protection, right? People could go to the area and trade. They could go and make their purchases. They could go and have social activities. They could go and basically do everything, right? Because they were secluded. And so what happens with the interstate is, when the highway comes in, it basically cuts right through the hub of that community. And urban renewal policies then come and further deteriorate what once stood as a beacon for these individuals. So now, by the time of Harambe, it's coming on the cusp of not only deindustrialization, but it's also coming on the cusp of the destruction of the original hub, right? And so African Americans don't have a place, and it never even got to where they did again. However, a lot of parents utilized Harambe as this new hub. So Harambe didn't just educate the children that were participants in the school. Harambe was a hub for the community. In fact, not even just the community. There were partnerships, even with colleges, Alverno College, because the people who lived in the area struggled to get to Alverno, which is a college on the south side. And then, of course, today we have these fast cars and transportations, we can get there, but in the 70s, it was a struggle to get there. So what happened was, Harambe fostered a partnership with Alverno, where a professor from Alverno would come to Harambe and teach class for the participants in Alverno in the Harambe facility. It allowed individuals to take classes who just couldn't get to Alverno. And so those type of partnerships is what Harambe served as. It also was a place where people from the community came to meet, right? And I'm bringing these anecdotes up to explain just the magnitude of what Harambe was. And when I say things like it was more than a school, I don't want it to get lost in the idea of a nostalgic memory of this school. It actually was more than just a school.
You know, that anytime you share these histories, the anecdotes are really powerful. It teaches us a lot about, as you are clear, the resiliency of Milwaukeeans, the communal nature of the city in the face of all of our challenges, as you highlight, right? This is the story in so many ways. Um, as you share that story about Alverno, then community engagement at universities is not new. You know, Alverno, UWM, the UW system in a lot of ways. There's a lot of rich history just around the broader sense of communal or community that Milwaukee has really put a stamp on and has really uh, taught other communities how to do so well. We should remain proud of that. And in the face of all of the challenges, let's be clear. But as you know, there's more to this Harambe story. Uh,
Absolutely.
and I don't even quite know how to ask this question with the precision it deserves, but I'll do my best. Harambe also has some important lessons in this conversation around charter and voucher schools.
Mhm.
Um, as best as you can with that as the prompt. Tease that out for us. Position Harambe in that broader political landscape. And also, just so we're clear, what year did Harambe open his doors, the school?
1969.
So 1969. I mean, this is Black Power. This is,
Yep.
and what does Harambe stand for? What
It
is
stands,
yeah, go ahead.
it stands for let's pull it together. It's actually
Yep.
a Swahili word. That was popular during that time in newspapers.
Absolutely.
For Jomo Kenyatta,
Yeah.
calling
Yeah.
the chant out to people, when people were reading that in the papers.
Right.
Of course, with the Black Power movement, this embracing of African identity becomes significant, and they sit
Sure.
down and they decide to come up with some names. And it was actually Ron Johnson who came up with the name Harambe. Well, he didn't come up with the name Harambe. He brought the name Harambe to the group and talked about what it meant. And it was the literal function of what they were doing. These
Yeah.
were people who were not, I mean, we're not talking about highly, financially successful. We're not even talking about people who, these people wouldn't form schools, right? But they felt like they had no choice, and they had to pull together
Yeah.
to make what they thought was going to prepare their children for academic success.
And just so
Um,
we're clear for the folks on the call, tell us about who this particular Ron Johnson is.
So Ron Johnson was an advocate himself, a community advocate, and a community member, a participant in the area, and he, was connected to this school through children and through just the community in general. So the meeting of these individuals were not just parents; they were people who were just a part of the community who wanted to see something, and they formed what we call Harambe.
Yeah.
Now, the narrative that we're going to bring it to choice, I should say. So Harambe goes through this period of deindustrialization, and the parents of Harambe are being severely impacted by what's happening, not only from employment, but also secondarily from the housing dilapidation from not being able to maintain. But these people are the parents of Harambe students at this time. Now, not only is that impacting Harambe directly, the Harambe's biggest source of income was the community. The community kept the doors open, not just the parents. There were people who were saying, "Hey, I'm going to give." They used to go door to door and basically ask for money to keep the school going, and that's how they were able to keep the school going, along with things like having corn sales at Summerfest and State Fair. That was the primary way. But deindustrialization reduces the income of the community surrounding Harambe. Not only does it reduce the income, but during the 80s and then by the 90s, the Harambe area is one of the most crime-ridden areas in Milwaukee at this time. Right. So there's a lot of change that has happened in the 20 years. Ironically, though, Harambe was able to have such a high academic plan that it drew the attention of politicians within Milwaukee and outside of Milwaukee. And so Harambe was used as, I'm not gonna say a test dummy, but Harambe was used to model what choice could be. And so Harambe participated in the first iteration of choice, of course, policies initiated by Annette Polly Williams, and in the 90s. So they embraced choice then. It wasn't the first time that they tried to use what we call choice, a voucher system. In the 70s, early on, Harambe was a part of a network of private schools, Bruce Guadalupe and others, and they tried to petition to get vouchers for the school to keep the doors open. Of course, teachers union voted no, and it was unsuccessful. It wouldn't be the 20 years later that choice policies were voted in, and Harambe took advantage of that. Well, not took advantage of that. Harambe utilized choice, which allowed them to educate more children. But Harambe is one of these lost stories in the history of choice and choice reform.
You know, it's such an important thread, and it provides such an important case study. I just have one more question on Harambe. You have a personal connection to Harambe, is that correct?
Yes, yes. I was a student of Harambe.
Yeah. Talk to us about your experience. I think that a lot of times as historians, we get taught that if it's too personal, we can't be objective and, all of this. But there is something very important, I think, about being a participant observer. Use those tools as a historian, look back on your experience and give us some of those jewels.
The unique thing about Harambe, and it's probably funny to historians, but it's probably a bore to someone who maybe not a student of history. Harambe taught history, all right? And Harambe was one of the first schools or places where people could actually come and learn about Black history. Now it's very popular now. Well, I shouldn't say now, in today's political climate, but there's a lot of common knowledge information that wasn't common in the 80s. Even individuals like Malcolm X were not common in the Midwest in the 80s to discuss. These were part of the academic program at Harambe to learn personal history, being at the predominant group of students were African American. That was part of the curriculum. And then in the 90s, they actually officially recognized that as part of a curriculum with a partnership with UWM. Dr. William Rogers actually came and trained the individuals, the teachers, in what we call Africology. And so Brownsville Histories Institute, which I'm the executive director of, we actually acquired the tapes of Dr. William Rogers providing his educational training. They were recorded, and so we still have that VHS. So we got to find some way to get to see them. But this is the environment of Harambe. Now, the students in Harambe then have this self-actualized identity that didn't exist outside of Harambe. So a lot of racialized issues the students were clearly aware of, but they had a different understanding of them. And I believe that was significantly important to individuals who come out and then end up going into academia or the professional world, which a lot of Harambe students end up doing. So having a personal connection to the school allowed me to not only be able to study it, but to witness it. A lot of articles that I was looking at during my research, I remembered the events. I remembered the vice president coming to the school. And then he came to the school because he wanted to see how are these kids in this neighborhood. Remember, this is in the 90s, and this neighborhood was feeling the impact of deindustrialization severely. That's the same area where in 2010, over 50% of African American males were unemployed and never were employed, right? This is the area that we're talking about, right? And so the president comes in. I remember the people sitting, I mean, what do you call those agents sitting on top of the roof the day before. I remember having conversations with Ruby D and Ozzie Davis because they wanted to come and see what this buzz was about. I remember meeting Betty Shabazz and her signing the autograph to me. And so these type of individuals, Dr. Mae Jemison, came to the school. These people wanted to see just what was going on in this poor school run by poor parents, but having such a high academic output, right? And so being there gives you a sense of uh, just really what was happening because many of those individuals are not in the papers for coming. They're not. They were in the city doing something else and came to Harambe, right? So for some of these things, you kind of had to be there. But this is the climate of this facility, which had of course, I talked about it having an integrated student population, but it also had an integrated teacher population. There were multiple cultures existed. Harambe also had one of the first Spanish and it also had one of the first computer programs early on. Again, these things are kind of common now, but in the era where they first initiated it, it was new.
Just the stories are just it's so remarkable. It is an important moment in not only Milwaukee history, but the nation's history, education history. We've talked about all the ways that Harambe resonates well beyond the moment and well beyond Milwaukee. Folks, we're going to start to move to Q&A. So if you have some questions, Olivia, please offer me some direction on how you would like to manage it. I'm comfortable taking questions in the chat from folks. If you want to unmute, I'm assuming that's okay. Don't let me get you in trouble though.
No, that sounds great. Everybody feel free to write
Okay.
out your questions in the chat, and Dr. Rob, feel free to read them on.
Yeah, and as we're at 1:17, so we've got a little over 10 minutes left. If anyone has a question and wants to raise a hand, I'll uh, call on you as well. So however I used to be Zoom savvy back about 5 years ago, in that time. I've lost my Zoom chops a little bit. Anybody want to offer some Q&A to Dr. Kitonga Alexander? Ooh, somebody from the iPhone. Okay. This question's about the Black family, Doc. It's speak to the moral value and stability of the Black family, whereby in the 70s there existed Black home ownership as an anchor meeting ground and place on behalf of the legacy of the Black family unit. Talk a little bit about the Black family, Black family, uh, some realities for Black families, if you will, and then there's some other info being shared here. So just give us some of your thoughts about family. You know.
Um, we talked about the destruction of the original community, or we talked about, I should call it the alteration. It wasn't destroyed, um, and I can prove why, but it was severely altered. The power of what we recognize as Bronzeville, and even the power of Harambe was the family. The Black family was the essential tool, not just for social support, but also for financial support. Uh, Kids participated in the financial support of the Black family. The Black family unit operated to where people played certain roles or took on certain roles for the well-being of all. And so one missing link from this story of Bronzeville, of course, because we look at it for the businesses, but we as my research, as I'm going deeper into it, I'm seeing that these entrepreneurs are entrepreneurs because of the participation in the Black family dynamic. And Harambe, I'm calling them parents, but Harambe was started by families. These were families who were able to say, "Hey, while you're at work, I'm gonna go to the school. I'm gonna cook the food." The the Harambe school didn't have a cafeteria. The Rays, which was a family in Harambe, actually built a cafeteria for the school. These were parents, right? They were recognized. They won an award for that. But this is the commitment of the family. So that's the what I argue in the dissertation is the most important part of Bronzeville. The most important part of Harambe is the Black family. So there's a significant role the Black family plays, and that's not just from forming in Milwaukee, right? A lot of this Southern roots, and we tend to look at the South as this place where people are coming to Milwaukee, and there's reports of them being the problem or them being the cause of crime. But in actuality, the Black family dynamic is rooted in the South. Many of those Southern families that came to Milwaukee with those values of the family. And if you look at the historical records and look at the entrepreneurs who were migrating from the South, you'll see the strong family dynamics that were there. So there is no Black Milwaukee without the Black family. Now, that may look a little different now as the individual construct becomes more. But initially, the family was the structure. And I'll say one more thing. I know we're short for time. I'm gonna say one more thing about the Black family. I love that question. But we have to also think about the migration. Many people who were participants of the migration, many people who came to Milwaukee initially came with an uncle or came with an aunt and lived with them until they were able to get off on their own. So the Black family becomes instrumental in even the migration itself. I was looking at Hattie McDaniel, the first Black woman to win think an Oscar. And she lived in Milwaukee for some years. Actually, Milwaukee is where her foundation was to even get to Hollywood. But while she was living here, she also took in people, right? She allowed people to stay with her for the whole time essentially as she was here. That's the dynamic of the Black family. And so it is this cultural thing that cannot be ignored.
I really appreciate that. And you've heard me say this over and over. The way that you're daring us to provide more complexity to our narratives is so important. And it even resonated with me. I was talking to my niece the other day, and she said, "Uncle, our family seems small now." And I said, "Yeah, well, we got some aunts and uncles who live in Germany because they serve in the military. We got some cousins that live in Atlanta. We got some cousins that live in Dallas. We always had the cousins over in Dayton. Then we got family in Detroit. And now we got family over here, so our family isn't small. We just move. We move for the opportunity. We move for a different experience. We're as a people, as a country, as a nation, as a globe, we're more mobile. It is a different time. But to the point there, to our friend in the chat, I mean, family is still vibrant. It might look a little different, you know, but family is still there. It might be a little harder to get the family reunion organized and scheduled. It was tougher to pick which city to do it in sometimes.
Yep.
But I'd rather have family in Germany and Dallas and Atlanta than not. because
Absolutely.
there's also places we get to visit that expands the family. As much as I do miss them being nearby,
Mhm.
I also like hearing about all their travels and all their experiences and seeing that cousin I never get to see who speaks 2 or 3 languages, and
Oh yeah.
all of it is there.
And don't forget
Ladies,
the kinship bonds too. The
yeah,
kinship bonds is a significant issue with in the African American culture, and that goes all the way back to slavery. That didn't disappear during the Great Migration. So some of these people having these aunts and uncles that actually weren't related, but they
right,
took them on and
right.
carried on as if they were. That was a essential tool, and it was an essential tool at Harambe.
Yeah. And it is both persistent today and also more widespread than folks probably realize. We may
Big
not
time.
use the language, but my son's godfather is my brother from another mother, right? Like that's my brother, whether, his sister calls me her other brother. So it's still alive and well and still very important. Olivia, I'm going to turn it back over to you. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me one more time in thanking Dr. Kitonga Alexander. And we want the book soon, just so we're clear about that.
Sure, sure.
Olivia, we'll give it back to you.
Yeah, thank you so much. We did have one more question in the chat if we may. And I want to respect everybody's time, so I can always send it
Oh yeah,
after.
please, no, please ask the question. I just missed it. I'm
Yeah,
sorry.
no problem. We have a question from Lindsay Draper here. Can you briefly address the activities of agencies such as NORCOT, Career Youth Development, and etc. to try and anchor services to support the community?
Can you read that question again?
I certainly can. Can you briefly address the activities of agencies such as Northcott, Career Youth Development, etc., to try and anchor, lost my spot, try and anchor services to support the community?
So there were a lot. Northcott. I think about Dr. Fred Bobo. There were a lot of agencies, and we're in the Harambe spirit with that idea. Those advocates were social advocates. They provided social support, but they also provided financial support. Dr. Fred Bobo was a dentist, but he also helped with what we call social welfare today. They called outdoor relief in the past. These agencies come and they become institutions. Now that institution was a part of the community, before the disruption. So it has a longer history. But those agencies were there. What Harambe became was to replace, not to replace, but to fill the gap of some of those agencies as they were dilapidated by the construction of the highway.
Thank you. And so that'll be our last call for questions. I just want to do some shout outs here and some thank yous before we all take to the rest of our day. I'm going to drop some links in the chat. I would like to ask you guys to consider taking time to fill out a community program survey. Let us know how we're doing. I did also include both the MCHS link and ABHM's link. Mia also shared the Historic Bronzeville's website link as well. So be sure to check us out all there. And I want to thank you all so much for joining us this afternoon. And I specifically want to thank Dr. Kitonga Alexander, our speaker, and our lovely host, Dr. Robert Smith. And I would like to thank you all again for joining us and thanking ABHM overall. And you can follow them on social media at ABHM or check out the link dropped in the chat for their website. Also, they have a great book club coming up next week, both virtual and in person. And that's going to be a book club for Dr. Cameron's book. And you guys can check out their information on social media or their website, Time of Terror. And like I said, on February 27th and 28th, they will have both virtual and an in-person book club. So be sure to check that out. Additionally, I want you guys to check out our website, and we really appreciate you all joining us this afternoon. Please stay tuned for more upcoming programs. We are continuing our virtual Lunch and Learn series next month, March 7th. And that's going to be helping folks to preserve and properly care for their family heirlooms to keep their own family history alive. I think that's a really unique opportunity for everybody. And if you'd like to see more programs like this one, please consider supporting the Milwaukee County Historical Society, the American Black Holocaust Museum, and Milwaukee Bronzeville. We recognize that Milwaukee County history spans across diverse communities, ethnicities, and cultures, so we hope to continue to bring us all together through these programs. And again, I'd like to thank you, Dr. Kitonga Alexander and Dr. Robert Smith, ABHM, and thank you all for joining us for this wonderful afternoon. Feel free to reach out with questions and we will connect another time.
Thank you,
Awesome.
folks. Thanks to the County Historical Society. Appreciate you.
Thank you. And Steve, we didn't use the pictures, but Steve participated by giving some pictures, so they recognize that.
Shout out to Steve. Yeah, check out our online digital collections for great African American photos of Milwaukee County. You can find that on our website as well. So great. Thank you all so much. Enjoy the rest of your afternoon.